Daniel Ricciardo is out of the RBF1 team for the rest of 2024 and Liam Lawson is in. So Scott, Ed, what do you make of this news?
Absolutely shocked. Who saw this coming? No, it's no great surprise after what happened in Singapore. It's very on brand for Red Bull to do this. I think it's a little bit of a shame the way it's been done. I think probably Daniel Ricciardo merited a slightly better farewell, although he kind of made it his own farewell, didn't he, in Singapore? So, yeah, ultimately, this has been coming for a while. It was only a question of whether it was now or he got a few more races to the end of the season. So, foregone conclusion, but now we know the timing. It's right now.
The Red Bull's situation with its drivers this year has been incredibly volatile. It's changed race to race what they've wanted to do. Remember, it was only a few weeks ago that we were going into the summer break thinking it was Sergio Perez that was going to get chopped, and Ricciardo was looking at a potential in-season Red Bull Racing promotion. So it has been all over the place. I agree with Ed. I think it could have been handled better. I think Ricciardo deserves a bit more than the embarrassment of an in-season dropping, but also just the way it was handled. I'm glad that he did grab control of the narrative a little bit and give himself that send-off, say his goodbyes, savour the moment. That was quite nice. But the way it's been handled didn't really make sense to me. But I've got a little bit of a developing theory of why they're really doing this for the last 6 races. And I'm sort of starting to make my peace with why it had to be so urgent.
Well, yeah, not a lot of this really makes sense. I mean, not a lot of anything Red Bull's been doing recently with drivers makes a lot of sense. But there has to be some kind of bigger play here, surely, because effectively what they're doing is dropping in season a driver they know absolutely loads about and replacing him with another driver that they know loads about. So what's really going on here, Scott?
I think the smoking gun is Christian Horner's comments during the Singapore weekend, where he said sometimes you need to make tough decisions to get the answers that you're looking for. Words to that effect. We can put the real quote on screen now, I'm sure, just so you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that doesn't make sense if you're looking at Lawson as an RB driver. They know everything they need to know about Lawson for the second team. He stepped in last year when Ricciardo was injured, did a perfectly good job, actually pretty good job, scored points and showed himself perfectly capable of that seat. What do you need to learn about Lawson in an RB? What you need to learn is about whether Lawson's a serious Red Bull Racing contender. And given all of those doubts about Perez, which I was alluding to earlier, I think that the reason for pushing this through so quickly for the rest of this season is so Lawson can be evaluated with a Red Bull Racing 2025 move in mind. See how he deals with the pressure. See how he does deal with a difficult situation, 6 races to come in and make his mark. See how Perez performs as well. But I think Perez is vulnerable, even though he's now basically secure for the rest of this year. And it's really whether Lawson has a bigger opportunity here for Red Bull in 2025. And whether or not Red Bull will admit that, whether or not they are specifically planning it with that in mind, this will become an audition one way or another. Because if he steps in and absolutely excels, Red Bull has to take him seriously.
Yeah, I'm with you, Scott. That's the way I see it. The only way it makes sense to me is that Red Bull, seemingly desperate to bin Perez anyway, anyhow, is basically rolling the dice for the last time on Lawson and hoping that he's the one that finally makes the grade. But are we missing a trick here, Ed? Is there any other way dropping Ricciardo now for Liam Lawson makes sense?
Yeah, I don't think it's something they had to do right now. Ricciardo's season hasn't been stunning by any means, but it hasn't been disastrous. I said to him in Singapore, do you almost feel like you've been a bit too in the middle with your performance? Because you can make a case for almost any of the possible things. They could promote him, they could keep him, they could drop him. And although he sort of said, yeah, I don't really want to be in the middle, he sort of accepted the premise. And incidentally, Ricciardo has always been great to deal with on this. Very honest, very direct, never taken umbrage at any of the questions being asked and conducted himself very, very well, I would say. So yeah, Ricciardo has had some good weekends, he's had some bad weekends. The season started poorly, but actually Canada onwards he started to perform better, and it's been a little bit more back and forth between him and Yuki Tsunoda, but ultimately Ricciardo hasn't made a good enough case that he can be that long-term driver for Red Bull. They brought him back to evaluate him to be in Red Bull Racing in the future, and he's really been nowhere near the level they want for that. So yeah, he's fine, but no more than that, and certainly a long way short of the levels of performance we saw from him in his F1 heyday, when at times he was absolutely incredible, and there were years when I would argue he was the best driver in Formula 1 in terms of his performance.
He agrees that he's come up short in his ultimate ambition. You know, he came back to try and make that Red Bull dream possible. Red Bull said that he was hired to be a backup to Perez if Perez faltered, and he's fallen short of that. So it's more the sort of bigger Red Bull picture in which he's failed, that kind of gamble on him, rather than specifically what he's done in an RB this year. But it's interesting, Ed mentioned Tsunoda in that. At the start of the year, we were wondering if Ricciardo actually looked truly terrible or if Tsunoda was absolutely smashing it. Then Ricciardo steps up, and instead of everybody thinking, oh, well, Ricciardo's now doing a really good job to beat Tsunoda, the question becomes, well, is Tsunoda suddenly underperforming? And it's like, whatever Tsunoda does in this scenario, he's just not going to get the credit for the job he's actually doing. I think Tsunoda's been largely pretty good this year. His peaks have been very good. I think he has had a couple weekends where he's gone missing a little bit too easily. But what this all shows, really, the theory about evaluating Lawson for a Red Bull seat, the fact that Ricciardo's he's out, but nobody really is championing Tsunoda, means that Tsunoda's probably just never going to get his flowers within the Red Bull organisation, is he? I don't think he's ever going to really be taken that seriously. And as it stands right now, I see no reason why he would be in contention to replace Perez next year.
No, it seems to me like he's become basically the new junior team benchmark driver, a guy who's never going to get promoted for whatever reason, because of character or ultimate pace or a combination of the two. And then whoever is alongside him in that team, they basically have to smash him to qualify or be considered seriously for promotion to the main team. And obviously Ricciardo, it's been fine, like Ed said, but he hasn't smashed Tsunoda, definitely. And Tsunoda beating Ricciardo was never going to do him much good, because everyone would always just say, well, Ricciardo was damaged goods from McLaren and not the driver that he used to be. So Tsunoda was always on kind of hiding to nothing, I think. But we've talked about Sergio Perez. That's kind of the bigger picture play here. Why is Red Bull so keen to bin off a driver that it only renewed contract terms with around the Monaco Grand Prix time for another 2 seasons? What's that all about?
Well, it's a situation that has been long in the making in the way that Red Bull's handled stuff. But in terms of Perez specifically, obviously he went through an awful run during this season. Red Bull's justification, lame as it was, for the new contract was it would help settle Perez down. It's the first case, I think, in recorded F1 history in which a driver has been given a new contract for being bad, and as a bit of a perk. Come on, you can do it.
That always works, of course, doesn't it?
And it didn't work. Perez continued to struggle. Red Bull has subsequently admitted that the car got worse than it kind of realised, than it gave Perez credit for, because Verstappen was basically driving around it. They didn't drop him in the summer break, which they could have done. They decided to redouble their efforts to support him. And actually, on the balance of the races since the summer break, he has definitely been better than he was before that. Singapore was particularly stinky as a weekend, but as a general rule, being better, being a lot closer to Verstappen. So he's now safe for the rest of this year, but he's still vulnerable beyond that. I don't think Red Bull does want to keep him because, as we've said so many times about Checo, the peak is not the problem, it's how dependable he is. And I think he's proven too many times now that he just can't be relied upon to be Verstappen's teammate long term.
It's extraordinary, really, that Red Bull is still lacking a decisive direction when it comes to this. They flip-flopped on Perez. All those rumours about him being dropped over the August break, those weren't made up. They were very, very close to dropping him. They were seriously considering it. Exactly, yeah. They created it because they came close to doing it. And they brought him in originally as a little bit of a stopgap, a kind of 1 or 2 year option, ideally while they sorted the rest of their driver scheme and made sure they had the right next cab off the rank. And here they are, still not necessarily sure they've got the correct next cab off the rank, which is extraordinary considering this is the team that has the resources and uniquely 4 seats in Formula One to develop its drivers. It should be really, really in control of this. It should have a great strategy driver-wise, but the fact they're still in this scenario is extraordinary. And, Sergio Perez, we know what he can do. He's certainly a better driver than he has seemed in the difficult times at Red Bull, but there have been too many tough times, which is why they don't see him as the long-term solution. But again, this feels like a hit and hope to me, because if they were convinced, say, Lawson was definitely good enough for Red Bull Racing, then they wouldn't have to do this trial, would they? So once again, it's Red Bull in a situation where they're hoping that their driver conundrum kind of solves itself rather than being really in control of everything.
Hit and hope is a good way of putting it, because that's what it feels like, a sort of desperate move. I mean, Perez, I think he was fine as long as the Constructors' Championship was there for the winning or in the bag like it was last year, whereas now it's McLaren to the fore and Red Bull is struggling. He's much more under the microscope again, but they just don't have a ready-made replacement. They've got Verstappen absolutely making the grade, and everyone else they have is just a sort of degree of underwhelming, and they just don't seem to know how to get themselves out of that position, which I guess is why they're kind of now more seriously talking up George Russell as a potential long-term possibility in that team. But anyway, back to Lawson and Ricciardo. Whether or not Lawson is on an audition for 2025, just in for this year, or in for next year in place of Perez, doesn't seem like there's any way back there for Daniel Ricciardo. So what next for the Honey Badger?
Yeah, this is it for him in Formula One terms. He rejoined the Red Bull organisation as a reserve because he hoped there would be a chance to see his way back into a frontline Formula One seat. By definition, that's failed. That's not going to happen. So he's not interested in making up the numbers. And also, there aren't actually other teams who are interested in him as well. So there aren't really options now. So I think he's quite comfortable with that. He was talking about that at Singapore the weekend, that he doesn't just want to be there for the sake of being there. He's given this a good go. It's not worked. And at least he'll have answered the questions he'll have had after the McLaren stint. He's gone into another team. He's had some good moments and some bad moments, and overall hasn't quite been good enough. So at least he's got answers to that. So I think for Ricciardo, it's now about the next phase of life. He was talking about that in Singapore as well. He said he's not scared of life without Formula One. He's spoken to other athletes in other disciplines about what to do. He's had a little bit of a taste of it when he was on the sidelines. So he's got plenty of ideas. He's got business interests as well. He's earned very well in his career, and there's things he's doing in the background. So he's someone who's thought about the next phase. So I think that's very positive for him, in that he at least isn't someone who's just desperately trying to hang on in Formula One and has got no clue of what else he's going to do. And that's why he didn't want to just hang around and be a reserve just in the hope that Sergio Perez twists his ankle one race weekend and he gets to go. That's not what this was about for Ricciardo. He's got a very clear idea of what his future is going to be, and if it's not in a Red Bull racing seat and with no hope of getting there, then it needs to be elsewhere. Maybe that'll be some other form of motorsport in the future, although that's not something that he's fully decided on as yet.
Yeah, it's something he had obviously a taste of. That's why I've dug these out. I thought he was out of F1 altogether a couple of years ago at the end of the McLaren stint. I think it was worth him rolling the dice and seeing if he could revive and restart his career at Red Bull. That he wasn't quite ready to let go of F1 completely. He had some questions he wanted to sort of answer himself as much as anything. You know, how much of it was McLaren, how much of it was him. He's come to the realisation, actually, it's more him than anything else, even though there were some very specific McLaren problems, because he's admitted he's struggling to get to the level he needs to consistently. He still thinks he's got it in him, but just not on like a properly regular basis. He feels that the level's been raised by younger drivers and he can't hit that level week in, week out. It's sad. I can't see him racing in F1 again. I wouldn't be surprised to see him in the paddock, hopefully fairly regularly. He's a great person to have around. Ed mentioned it earlier. I've got nothing but respect for the way he's conducted himself, not just through this whole process with Red Bull, but the McLaren stint as well. I thought he was absolutely exemplary, and genuinely, like, drivers should take notice of the way Ricciardo kind of handled that whole situation for the last 3 or 4 years. But his time has come to an end. He's not the driver that he used to be, and it's better for him not to hang around making up the numbers, and it is better for Red Bull to look for the future. If that's Lawson in the senior team, great for Lawson. If it's someone else coming in Ricciardo's place next year, even better as far as Red Bull's concerned. They need to start blooding some younger drivers, and Ricciardo can't justify occupying a seat at the level that he's been at ultimately for the last couple of years.